There is literally nothing you can do to control the weather, but that doesn't stop pretty much every runner I know from obsessing about it before race day. Spring races are super unpredictable too, and that's especially true for anyone who's running the Boston Marathon this year and is familiar with weather in previous editions. You might not be able to control the race day weather, but you can actually do a lot to prepare for it. In this podcast with Coach Andy, we talk about how much the weather impacts your race performance and strategies to prepare for any weather from cold and windy to hot and humid. As a bonus, we also debate the ideal running weather because it's actually pretty contentious. It almost doesn't matter though, because let's be honest, perfect weather is pretty much never gonna happen. There's a saying that goes, fail to prepare and prepare to fail. I think that's especially true when it comes to training for conditions on race day. So let's get into it and talk about how to perform your best in any race day weather. One of my favorite topics to talk about today, but nothing but the weather, warm, cold, crazy. Springtime is here and we get all kinds of weather. Andy, are you excited for this topic?
Yeah, super excited to chat about it. I've already had a couple experiences this year, and it's also something that we're already talking to clients about with upcoming races in the spring being a little bit more challenging when it comes to adversity and weather. So yeah.
What's some of the crazier weather you've encountered recently? Because I can say up in Toronto here, we've definitely had a long and extended winter.
Yeah, in here in in Chattanooga or in the South, Raleigh even, it's pretty similar weather to Chattanooga. It's this time of year can just be super variable between is it going to be hot? Is it going to be cool? Is it what are we going to get? So even this last week, it was in the upper 80s, almost 90, hitting record highs in the last week in March. And I remember even last year, we got married around this time, and I remember it being cool. Like it was like I remember trying to figure out if I needed a jacket, like for after the wedding, when am I going to get cold? So, because it was supposed to be maybe in the 40s. And so that temperature differential and not knowing what to expect this time of year is I think can be super challenging. More recently, a race I did mid March in Raleigh was severe weather was expected. So there was a storm coming up across from the west, and it had already caused tornadoes and damage in different places. And so when it got to Raleigh, it was a little bit more just rain and wind, and not as bad as it had initially been expected, but. It made for a challenging day and probably one of the first races I'd done this year in the heat. And so that and I mean I hadn't had a lot of exposure to it in training either. And so if you're not getting that constant repeated, it just feels that much harder. And so that day it was there was some pretty good headwinds at the end of the race. There was and I just remember feeling like I was trying to go uphill into the wind at points. And so that made for just some challenging experiences on top of it just being super humid and a little warm and just having to adapt a little bit more. And so those are things that we can run into. And but then we can also talk about sort of how Boston has been in the last several years. Last year it was super warm. It was probably the first warm day of the year for most people who are racing, and so that was a challenge. But then in years past, there was, I think, was it 2018 when it just downpoured and was freezing, and it was miserable for most of the people out there. So there can be such a variety, and I think the spring also brings a unique challenge where we don't have as much time to adapt to the more adverse conditions, whereas the winter time we're we're getting into more ideal temperatures as we go through the year, and so we're kind of getting a boost, whereas right now we're trying to figure out how to adapt and how to adjust racing and training and all that stuff for different types of conditions that we haven't gotten as much exposure to yet.
Yeah, that to me is always one of the hardest parts of spring is not just that the weather's unpredictable, but that you're not used to it. I think when you come to fall time, you can still sometimes get some weird weather, but it's rare that it's so cold that it's going to affect your race unless you really race later in the year. Whereas, if you get a warm day like you did at Boston last year and you haven't had any time to acclimatize, it can really take a lot out of you.
Yeah, it's like something that you don't realize is as tough when you're approaching this type of stuff going into the fall. You don't, 60 in the fall may not feel might feel nice if you've been training in much warmer conditions, whereas 60 in the spring could be, a pretty good temperature swing from what you'd been training in and racing in. So It just the way that you get to that same temperature will feel different based on the time of the year, and so how well we can actually train and race in that is it can be dependent upon the person, but is also going to change how we can race in it. So
Yeah, and I think that's what we'll get into more today because, the weather you have no control over it. There's no, I know a lot of us do, I myself included, obsess about the weather leading into a race, but there's nothing you can do about what the weather is. What you can do is prepare yourself both mentally and physically for whatever the conditions might be ahead of time in your training.
yeah, and I think that's the most important thing that I mean, I've had experiences where I had a year where I felt like every race that I went into was just warm or it had bad weather and I was getting frustrated because I wasn't running fast times, but and it kind of made that year I kept pushing harder and harder to try to run fast times, and that's just not going to happen in that and if it's warm weather. And so you kind of have to be able to separate yourself from the times that you're running and be a little bit more understanding of like how are these conditions going to affect me so that I can run a good race for the conditions and use that for a positive growth mindset instead of allowing it to sort of suck you down with it. So that year, I mean, I placed third or second or something like that at one of the races I did, but the time was a lot slower than, and I remember just being so upset about the time, not even thinking about how well I raced for, I placed high. That's a better marker of success on that day than the time. And I just remember thinking like way too much into the time. And I always now think about the example of Des winning Boston because that day, like the times were not fast out that day. I mean, it was a challenging day to run fast. And so it was super impressive to run as fast as she did. But if she had run that same time, maybe on a different day, would she have been happy with that? And would she, that I think that's, and then but then you think about, well, she won the race. And that's the important factor is you kind of have to have your Des moment of like, hey, my time might not have been fast, but look where I placed. And that ends up being sort of a little bit better indicator of how well you performed over what the time might have been. So,
Yeah, and you hear quotes of her talking after that race, and it's such an elite athlete's mindset where, it's not this approach of complete disappointment that the weather's not what you expected. It's this mental mindset of like, I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna compete, and if the weather's crap, so be it. I can run as well in those conditions as anybody else here who's going through the same thing as me, and that takes a lot of practice.
yeah, it definitely create. You have to have that mindset going into it that we're kind of working something differently in this race. Like it's going to be a more competitive race rather than a race for who can run the fastest time today. Like what we're not looking at that as much. We're really looking at like who can be the strongest when it's the most adverse. And so that's how you kind of have to look at these experiences as like these are some races that show us who the strongest athletes are because they can overcome some adversity within the race, and that's I think also something that is good to see. And I think it's kind of it's another variable that we can explore.
Yeah. And just before we get to move on from this topic, I think there's probably some runners who will listen to this and go, that's great for Des, but at the same time, she's an elite athlete. She's getting a lot of press for this win and, financial reward too. There's a lot of incentive. What do you tell your athletes if they have in their mind that they really want to go for a certain time and they don't have those same, financial incentives to place high, how they approach a race when the weather maybe doesn't permit that PB or PR?
What I've been using is thinking about it from so Runners Connect has a temperature calculator that I've started using, and I think sometimes it can even be a little bit conservative with their estimations, but it also kind of gives you just a little bit of realization of how the conditions might be affecting your pace. And so I will sometimes use that so that I can kind of see if I type in even post race, like I'll put in what I raced and what the conditions were and or I'll put in what the conditions were, and I'll sort of figure out what the equivalent pace like. So what did I end up averaging? If I ever ended up averaging like 6 minute pace, what would the equivalent be based on that calculator? Like what would it be saying that that pace is equal to? And maybe if it's a really warm, hot, crazy day and it's like the difference is 540 pace, like cool. So I sort of have used that to my advantage to be like, all right, If I run about this pace on race day with it being the conditions that are going to be out there, if that's equivalent to about a 540 pace, like I can kind of think about that. Is that a PR pace? Like if I could run 540, would that be a PR pace? And I think that can help us to get a little bit better just recognition and sort of, of it gives us a better perception of how well we performed when time is harder for us to actually realize, like we're not going to run as fast when it's hot. And if you really want to run a good race and enjoy it and feel strong at the end, you have to be okay with that. You have to be able to be prepared ahead of time that we're adapting and that we need to slow these paces down and that the conditions are not going to warrant going for a PB. And so how can we equate though what we need to slow down by so that we can still sort of rationally understand that, like, if it were cooler, I probably could have PB'd, like that's how I sort of have started trying to push athletes into sort of thinking about it in those terms, and so using that calculator to give them better perspective over what they've done. And I think that's a good way for us to kind of not be almost like a slave to the time that we're running, because it's just like those things that are out of your control. You don't want to be so fixated on them that it takes enjoyment out of the sport. Like that's what my experience was, and it just made it not fun to race. And at the end of the day, like if it's not enjoyable, you're not going to race well anyway. And so if you're constantly worried about time or not adjusting for the conditions, you're going to be having races that are hard, like super hard. You're positive splitting all the time and stuff like that, and it'll just drain you. And that's kind of what I've been trying to push athletes away from is remind yourself of why you're out here, and then find the best way to have the best race today, this day, only focus on today. And then realizing that the times are not always a reflection of your fitness, but we can find ways to see how they reflect our fitness in different ways.
Yeah, I like that. Really taking the day for what it is. I want to have a little fun here with the calculator, and I will link it in the show notes as well. But just because you mentioned it and this answer surprised me, I'm going to use the example of an 80-degree day, and I'm going to put that as the dew point too. For an 8-minute miler across a marathon, what pace do you think it spits out as the equivalent compared to perfect conditions?
Wait, so you said 80 degrees, and what was the dew point?
80.
80. Okay, so that's like going to be a pretty steamy day. And you said 8-minute pace. I'm going to guess that it's probably going to slow you down by, like, I don't know, 30 seconds a mile.
That was pretty good. It says 8:28, so you were
All
pretty
right.
spot on.
All right.
But
Yeah.
I
That's
was gonna
awesome.
say I actually thought it was gonna be even worse than that. And to me, 28 seconds is a lot, but 80 degrees is a ton of heat. I think that's probably more accurate for a well-trained athlete. And if you're like an especially heavy sweater, it could impact you more than that.
Oh yeah, there's definitely a spectrum with that calculator too. Like everyone's gonna be a little bit more different in terms of how they respond to heat and how their body's adapted to it. So like I know that I feel like I tend to be like a run hot, so I like a good like 30-degree day, and I know people who don't like 30, that's too cold for them, and then they're constantly trying to warm themselves up. And so there's going to be a spectrum of where you fall that's best temperature wise. But so that, and if you're someone like me, you may need to give yourself even more of a little bit more buffer than that calculator is indicating. And so it's just kind of knowing yourself on kind of what efforts, and then taking opportunities where it might be a little bit warmer. And especially if you're not sure what race day will be like, um figure out kind of how you feel on easy runs and when you adapt, or even if you have a workout on a warmer day and go ahead and start slower and see what that temperature differential is for you. Like how is the temperature affecting your paces? Is it 10 seconds on a day when it's X temperature? Is it 10 seconds on a day when the humidity is at this level? Or kind of like coming up with some different things for yourself. And that's actually what I've done. I think I had one workout earlier this year where it was like a weird 70-degree day. Um, and I ran kind of too late in the day. And I ended up, it was 4 by 2 miles, and I knew it was going to be warm. And so I said, just start at a pace that feels tempo effort. So I've practiced a lot to try to really nail down efforts and sort of feel what those feel like, and that's something I've been trying to encourage athletes to do. I think it's an acquired skill. It takes practice, and so I always encourage people to practice effort over pace, because essentially on race day that's what helps us to get in the right pace zone and make sure we don't overdo it for different conditions. And so I went out and I just said, okay, what does the effort feel like today? And so I went out at a pace I felt like I could maintain for all the sets. And so that ended up being, about 10 seconds slower than I had planned for the day. And so that gave me a better estimation of how I should adjust workouts for different temperatures. And so that was what helped me the most, was that, and then also having played around with that calculator to kind of see what it recommends, and then translating that onto myself, and seeing how I sort of perform in relation to it. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the way I think about it too, is it gives you a good baseline or average for the population, but th the same way, when you put in a calculator for how many carbs you need, everybody's a little bit different. I think it's the same thing where it's a good starting point, but you can kind of figure out what works for yourself.
Yeah. And I'd always rather have people start too slow. So if that spits out 28 seconds and you want to go ahead and start 35 or 40 seconds slower, that's going to be better overall for you than to force it right at 28 seconds and then find out that, oh, you needed a little bit more time. Like maybe your buffer needs to be 35 seconds. Because the worst thing you can do in a race that's warm is go out too hard. There's just a lot of different things that start to get, I mean, we know that when it's warm, your heart rate increases. If your heart rate's increasing, that means you're going to be burning more glycogen, because where your heart rate is also determining when you switch from fat burning to carb burning. So we see that happening, and then we see our getting dehydrated faster. We're going to be reaching that lactate threshold point sooner. And so if you're starting too quick in the heat, you're going to have a much harder race day. And so that's where it's like we're better staying on the side of caution and starting too slow, and then adapting later, because that's going to help us get the best out of ourselves on the day. We're not going to burn through resources quite as quickly, and that's going to be more optimal.
Yeah, you can always speed up if you feel good in the second half. Once you've burned all your matches, it's really tough to come back from that.
Yeah, and in hot races, when it just is, I feel like it's just there's nothing like just being in a hot race, having gone out too hard. You're just out there on that black top, the sun's beating down on you, and it's demoralizing. I can just picture it right now. The frustration of that. So
Yeah. I want to come back to one thing you said, which is you actually like it if it's a 30-degree day. Because even living in a pretty cold climate over the winter, that's definitely cold for me. By 30 degrees, once it starts dipping below that, I'm thinking about putting on tights for the race. I think 38, 40 is kind of closer to my ideal, but would you say 30 if you could pick any weather in the world? Is that what you would pick?
I mean, that's what my PRs have been in, just about right around 30. So I mean, I would be probably 30 to 40 is probably fine for me. But I think I even qualified when I qualified for the trials in 2016. It might have been 20 something that day in Indianapolis, and I was in shorts, and I think I had on a singlet and arm sleeves, and then just like an ear warmer, and I might not have been, I don't know if I was wearing gloves. That was back before and I was newly post collegiate. I don't think I had gloves, so I might have been still wearing socks on my hands when I was running. Because that was what I did for a few years post collegiately, was I wore socks on my hands instead of buying gloves because I was being cheap. Um, and so I don't even know if I was wearing gloves in that race. I think I just had my hands tucked into my arm sleeves. So, but that was, I remember not being cold when I was racing. Like I didn't really feel it. But when I went out after the race, I was going to go spectate the marathon. I walked out and I was like, oh, I can't do this. I can't. Was it this cold when I was racing? I don't remember that. But yeah, I would definitely prefer the cooler the better. I feel like I just end up sweating sooner than most people, maybe, or I think I burn through more salt. I think I'm a pretty salty sweater, so it's hard for me to keep salt stores up when it's warmer and even remotely warmer. So,
Yeah, and I think I probably brought this up on other shows, but one thing I'm a huge fan of is throwaway layers. And I think when people think of throwaway layers, they think, maybe just a jacket or just sweatpants. I'm thinking everything. Like you can throw away just about everything on the start line, from hats to jackets to sweatpants to a second pair of socks and then even gloves. Like
hmm
sometimes if it's really cold, I like to have two pairs of gloves before I get going, or it's nice to have like one of those like dollar store gloves that you don't feel so bad if you toss them away during the run. It just allows you to adapt and go based on how you feel as opposed to worrying that you brought the right amount of layers.
right. And that's also one of those things that, I mean, I did a race over I think it was on Thanksgiving here and it was 28 degrees. And I always do a good warm up and I wear several layers so that when I do end up taking off the clothes that I'm not going to wear to race in, it's real close to the start of the race. And that way I'm able to keep my body temperature up because that's one of those things that the longer that you're standing there cold, and if you start shivering, you're actually using energy to try to keep your body warm. And so the longer that you're in that state, the more energy you're wasting, the more that you're losing actually time on your race. Your lactate threshold is lower when you're cold, so you hit that sooner. We have our muscle contractions are slower. All of that stuff gets impacted if we aren't properly warmed up. And so a lot of these bigger marathons where you have to stand in the corral at least what 30 20 I don't even know when you have to line up in the corral pretty early and you don't have the ability to kind of do a little dynamic warm up or do a couple minutes shakeout or something like that, then those extra layers are super important to making sure that we stay warm and that we aren't using any energy to try to keep ourselves warm. I think we also do end up burning through more glycogen too if we're cold. And so we want to be very careful that we're not allowing ourselves to reach those freezing cold points before the race. And that specific race, there was a guy, I saw him out there even 30 minutes before the race just wearing shorts, and he wasn't even wearing a shirt. It was 28 degrees. He had a face mask thing come up over his face, but for the most part, he wasn't wearing enough clothes to really keep him warm, and so that was interesting to me because that's not the most effective strategy for racing. It's just not. There's like we have a variety of issues that can go wrong. You could pull a muscle from being too tight from being cold, and your muscles not being prepared to contract as fast as we need when we race, and yeah. So that's yeah. When we've been talking about heat a lot, but in the cold we also do want to be prepared layers wise to make sure that we're not leaving time on the table from being cold.
Yeah, and I will add, our runner's kind of calculator. I actually tried as well, putting it down to like 0 degrees, and I don't think it adjusts the time. But if you have to throw on extra layers and stuff, or and your fingers are freezing, that is definitely going to affect your time. So definitely make sure you build that in as well.
Yeah, I don't think the calculator works in reverse very well. I've tried that too with clients racing because I've even tried to figure this out because I wanted to know how much does the cold affect, because we know that it does. We know that
Hmm.
you're going to be slower. We're going to have to adjust a little bit, especially when it's below a certain temperature and it gets really cold. Like there are things that you have to do to adjust a little bit. Um, but I couldn't find any specific ways to adjust. I mean, I think I saw somewhere that like you might be like 3 to 5% slower in the cold, but that's hard to really grasp how much of a difference that is, and what pace that means you should go at. And so, but I do know that in a lot of ways, as long as you can keep your body warm, we can negate some of that. So, it's just good to know sort of that there is some impacts in what we can do.
Yeah, for sure. Before we get into sort of preparing for the weather, I want to make sure that we touch on a couple other conditions because I think until now we focused on temperature and humidity. But let's talk about wind because I think that's one that has the potential to really affect your race, especially if you're running something like Boston, which is point to point. There's the possibility that you could have a headwind the entire way.
Yeah, I was thinking about this because I've had some clients who've been dealing with some windy conditions lately, and even myself, I had a workout I did. This was last week or a couple weeks ago, and I did an out and back and it was, I could tell I was feeling like the way out felt relatively easy, and I was like, hmm. And then when I flipped around, I was a good like 15, 20 seconds, 15 20 seconds slower per mile, or per split than I was trying to be. And when I looked at my data when I finished, like the power meter on my watch, it was showing, you could see it was like a mark, like the difference was so apparent, like how much harder I was working going into the wind despite being 15 seconds slower on each of my intervals. And so I think that's important to recognize that it does have an impact, and it does require you to work harder, and it's kind of like running up hills. If you force yourself to try to keep pace running into the wind, it'd be like running super hard up a hill and then being exhausted for what comes next. And so we have to sort of find ways to adapt. But the good thing about wind is if you can find yourself a group to run in, that's going to help us to, uh, prevent some of that. The other important thing that I've read before is that the difference between, so the headwind has a more impact on us on our times than a tailwind helps us. So even if you're like banking, you're doing a race that's out and back, and you're banking on, this tailwind, once you turn around, it's going to be so much easier. It's going to be so much better. Like, yeah, you're going to be faster, but it's important to recognize that if you're running into the headwind the first half, that's going to slow you down more than it's going to help you coming back. And so factoring that into your time a little bit, that we might need to go a good bit slower into it, and expect to not have quite as much of a boost coming back. So that's something to also consider. But if you can run in a group, especially in a place like Boston where there are tons of people, try to work with people, alternate who's leading, alternate who's taking the force there. And even if you're in a group, it does help to sort of, even if you're not in the front, does sort of help to, help displace that a little bit. But you can actually get a good amount of help from not like sitting behind and coasting a little bit and not taking that force on directly. There's a definite, like, a market increase that you can get in your pace just from being able to sort of tuck in behind some people and let some other people take the win for you. Of course, I would try to kind of work with the other people in that group. So occasionally you might have to take the wind, and that means you might have to use a little bit more energy during those periods. But then if you can tuck back in and just alternate out, it'll help you a good bit to conserve when you have the opportunity to kind of tuck back in behind people. So avoiding, if it's a windy day, trying to avoid as much as possible running alone. This might mean that you might have to throw some surges in. So if you're with a pack and you're like, I think I can go a little quicker, see where the next group of people is, surge up to them, and then tuck in so that you can minimize the amount of time that you're running alone into the wind. So that can really help us, just to kind of work through it. And that might mean you have to be kind of adjusting the goals for the day a little bit. But the wind does have a pretty profound impact on, and it's going to make you have to work a lot harder. And so you're going to have to sort of approach it as just like get that effort right. Try not to work too hard into it if you're alone. Adjust, just kind of see like, okay, what feels like the same effort? What feels sustainable for me to keep going at into this wind? The hardest part about wind is that it's so hard for us to actually quantify how much of a difference it's going to make. And this is where that effort training really comes into play, is knowing exactly how much it affects your pace, for different, is it 10 miles per hour, is it 20 miles per hour, is it just the occasional gust? And so there's no way to know for a constant what that's going to be like. And so you might have to just be able to, find ways to just adjust on the fly, relax your pace when you're going into it, and maybe ignore your pace a little bit when you're going into it, just to keep us from, imploding later because we were working way too hard against a wind that we had no control over. So,
Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels there between wind and hills. For one, the same way you can have different speeds, different incline of hill is going to affect you in different ways. But the other piece is you touched on the fact that a tailwind is going to help you, but not as much as a headwind hurts you. And I think it's the same thing with uphills and downhills. I'm looking right now, we actually do have an article on Runners Connect that I'll link about how much wind affects your time. And the example they give here is if you have a headwind of 10 miles per hour and you're running 6 minute mile pace, and we're assuming that this is a perfect headwind going the exact opposite direction as you, it's going to slow you down about 12 seconds a mile. And then if you have a tailwind going at that same pace, it's going to speed you up 6 seconds a mile. So
Yep.
obviously those numbers can vary, but that feels about right, whether it's a hill or a wind, that, when it benefits you, it's about half as much as it's going to hurt you the other way.
Yeah. And I think that article also mentions that the speed at which you're running into a headwind also changes how much it affects you. So the faster you're going into a headwind, the more that it's going to slow you down. Whereas if you're going slower into a headwind, you're not going to be as quite as impacted by it, which makes sense if you've ever done an easy run versus trying to do a workout into those same conditions that you feel you can probably keep your pace a little bit easier on your easy runs into the wind, whereas you may not be able to as much on a speed day. So.
Yeah, it's like a double whammy. If you try to maintain your pace in the wind, not only is it going to feel like you're sprinting, you also have additional drag from the wind too.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny, I always think about doing track workouts back in college on the track when on a windy day. You half your lap, you're just like bearing into this wind and trying to figure out a way to get through it. And then the other half, you're just kind of, and so I remember when I would do workouts, I'd be like checking splits and they would just make no sense ever. You're just look down, you're like, well, I'm too fast, but I guess that's okay because I'm about to run into the wind pretty hard. And so you just be negative splitting or positive splitting like crazy through intervals. And that's okay. Like that's going to be sort of something you're just going to have to be okay with is the pace being a little bit more variable in different sections when the wind's blowing harder than others and knowing whether or not is it gusts that we're dealing with that day that will be challenging or are you going to have a constant wind throughout. So
Yeah, I think I've had days on the track back when I was in high school where, if you have gusts up to like 40 miles an hour, I might be running, you know, 70, 80-second splits on the track, and literally half that time will be the very last 100 meters just because you're slowed down so much by the wind and then getting the benefit on the other end.
yeah, I have like visualizations of me right now, like running into the wind and just leaning into it and just trying to like fight through it. And I mean, when you're just doing a single interval, that might be fine. But on a race day, if you're constantly just digging into it, it can be really hard. And the race that I did recently that had some wind, it was mostly like towards the end that I noticed it. And it was a lot of the sections when I was like last 5K. And so if it's at that point, whatever it takes to get through it, just push your body with whatever you've got. But if you're hitting these wins pretty early in a race, that's where you're really going to want to make sure you're not overdoing it. Late in a race, just bury your head and just go. Just push, do what you got to do. Work through each kind of gust that comes at you because it was gusts that I was dealing with where it would be fine 1 minute and the next minute it felt like you were running into a wall. And yeah, nothing you can do about it but work through them in those moments. And so that was what I sort of did. And at times I felt like I was not picking my feet up. I was like, I am not moving forward. And that's okay because I did. I finished. It was fine. It was challenging. But if you hit those at the end of the race, just, do whatever it takes to just push through them. It's like finishing up hills and stuff. You just kind of have to bear down and go for it.
Yeah. All right, just before we get into how to actually prepare for these weather conditions, there's one more I want to touch on, which is rain. And I think it's a funny one because a little bit of rain won't necessarily impact you the same way a little bit of wind will. But when it's pouring, it really sucks and it tests you physically and mentally. I just ran a 30K about a week ago where it was pouring the whole time, and let me tell you that it's not easy.
No, it's definitely a lot harder. I think we don't realize that it's going to be harder, but it does add a layer of challenge, and you probably are going to be a little bit slower from it. So just kind of something you have to prepare yourself to for as well. Um, I'd say too I remember having this conversation a couple years ago before Boston, and I was like, I don't think I've ever really run in a race that's been raining the entire time. And then I ran like literally the next weekend I ran a race and it rained the entire time. And I was like, karma, cool. Yeah, that was Boston, I think 2 years ago that was a little bit rainy. And so it can make you cold. And so that's one factor you want to keep in mind is the temperature and the rain. How is that going to compound, and what do you need to do to make sure you're not then freezing on the course? Because that's the hardest. Is like, if it's snowing, it's one thing, but when it's raining, it's just soaking you, and then you're just cold, running in the cold while being wet, and that's just miserable. And body temperature will drop. It'll be hard to keep your temperature up and all that stuff, which will affect your performance. And so we want to be mindful of that. Also, it's going to make the shoes feel heavy. We want to be careful with what types of shoes we're wearing because they'll be slicker. Some shoes, you got to look at those soles and see if they're how they well they perform on the roads when they're slicker, when they're wet. So it's good to recognize how your shoes perform in that type of stuff, and if it's smarter for you not to wear a super shoe in those conditions. If the super shoes feel like they're a little bit slicker, you don't have as good a traction and or control over your feet. So that might be something to consider. The other thing is, and I remember one of my friends, we both had the same coach, and we were talking about this, and she was saying how she was going to run the treadmill because it was raining. And our coach was like, it could be raining on race day. why are you avoiding the rain? And and then we were laughing about it because then now I think about that every time when it's raining outside, and I'm like, it could be raining on race day. So that's important to recognize that, rain's not going to hurt you. If it's not severe storms, you probably should do some training in the rain every once in a while just to make sure that you know how it's going to affect you on race day. You know how you're going to perform in it. Because it very well could be raining on race day. And what is that going to do to you? And are you going to be mentally prepared to deal with it on race day if it's raining? So, not being afraid that to run in the rain, I think is important that we do that every once in a while. We don't have to do it every time. Don't test your willpower so much that you end up hating running by the time you get to your race. But, kind of put yourself in some adverse conditions every once in a while, not unsafe conditions, just adverse, the ones that are less optimal for running. Just so that we have those experiences to go off of. One thing I will say though is if it's a warm day and it starts to rain, that's great. Like take it in. It's going to help us keep a little bit cooler at the very least. Soak in that rain a little bit, kind of enjoy it, I would say. Um, but just have sort of a plan of action for that. Like if it's going to be super rainy, like do you need to figure out how to keep yourself dry for as long as you can before the race starts? Those are things to consider. I know people have used like trash bags and things like that.
Yeah.
We talked about also like how do you keep your feet dry so you're not blistering and stuff like that in your shoes. So those are things to consider. All this stuff becomes a little bit more important for preparation. I'd say when you're having a rainy race day is so much more crucial because there's a lot more things to consider to make sure you feel good. So,
And I think anti-chafe is a must if it's raining.
oh yes, oh for sure. Definitely need the anti-chafe. So,
Yeah. The idea of going out and running in the rain intentionally, it brings up an interesting training philosophy because I think there's one camp where there's an argument that you should make training as enjoyable as possible to make it as sustainable as possible and help you get in more training. And then there's another camp where it should kind of be as tough as possible because you want to mimic race day and you want to sort of callous yourself to getting used to it. And personally, I kind of fall in the middle where I like to make my easy runs as comfortable and cushy as possible, and then workout day, whatever the weather, like I'm getting out, I'm not moving that around. But I interviewed I think a month or two ago, Matt Fitzgerald, and in his book he talks about what he called the pebble effect, and it was one pro runner who he spoke to. I can't remember, but he talked about how they would never take pebbles out of their shoe. And the argument was kind of training yourself to just get used to whatever goes wrong on race day. And I thought that was a really interesting thing to talk about.
yeah, that's I also would fall in more in the middle. I think it's important to have experiences on both ends, but also ensure that you're still enjoying what you're doing. I don't think it needs to be that every single day is just unenjoyable and awful and you're just killing yourself all the time. Unless you enjoy that. I mean, that's also fine. um, but I mean, I think like there has to be some balance there. And I always think about what Alexi Pappas said. I heard her talk about this, I feel like, in an interview I saw where she talks about the rule of thirds. And she says that, a third of your runs are going to be awful and not great. And a third of your runs will be just okay, and then a third of your runs will be great. And so just having that sort of perspective about training is I think good for balance. And then she also talked about willpower and how we have things that draw on our willpower and we have things that fill our willpower up. And so if we are constantly draining our willpower, it affects every area of our life. If you're just your willpower to do things is completely empty. And so having that balance with yourself of making sure you do have enough things that do fill your willpower back up. And that might be that those easy runs being in good, enjoying them and making sure they're in good conditions is part of that. And then workout days, it is what it is. Whatever that is for you that makes it work well, that you still are consistent with training, I think that's the important part. Because especially with a lot of runners, consistency can be a challenge through winter, especially, or hot summers. Staying consistent is really tough. And so if we have to do some things to make that a little bit more enjoyable, then the consistency is the most important factor for continued growth and performance. So whatever that means to you balance wise, not doing every run in the terrible conditions and finding ways to make them more enjoyable or a little bit more manageable is fine. That's kind of what we have to do to stay motivated and keep enjoying what we're doing, and keep consistent.
Yeah, and I think from a mental preparation standpoint, people assume it has to be doing exactly what it's going to be on race day. But I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I think even visualization can help, and I think training in tough conditions, whatever they are, is going to prepare you. You know, if your race is you're expecting it to be 80, 90 degrees, maybe do some of your runs in warm weather. Don't do all of them in 40 degrees, but
Yeah.
running when it's pouring rain is still going to build up a type of mental toughness that you need on race day.
Yeah, and that's where I think that variety comes into play, is being able to recognize that a variety of different experiences help you prepare in different ways. Being uncomfortable when it's super cold or warm is beneficial. Being uncomfortable when it's raining is beneficial, for us to have a little bit an ability to know what to expect if we end up with those conditions on race day. But that doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that you can't. Uh, Enjoy your runs that are on perfect weather days, even in preparation for a race. I will say though, from if your race is going to be warm, from a heat acclimation standpoint, there does need to be some amount of prep work. If you're, we don't know a lot of those variables until we get close enough to race day, what weather is going to be like, and it can change so rapidly that we actually, I tend to be like, don't look at the race day weather until it gets a little closer, but be prepared for, if you look at it and you're like, oh, there could be a storm, just know that so you can pack properly. Um, and then if it is going to be warm, just sort of keeping an eye on it to know exactly what it's going to be like, and doing the things that you might need to do to prep for that so we can acclimate as much as possible. And I remember having a coach that told me to, especially leading into the race during the taper, doing some easy runs like on the treadmill if it was going to be cooler out and I was going to go race in a warmer space, doing some easy runs on the treadmill, and wearing, say, like a long sleeve, in that, wearing more layers, so that I was sort of building up a little bit more heat, so that we're sort of a little bit adapting. It's not going to be perfect, especially if it's going to be humid, because it's hard. That's a lot harder to replicate. You can do some time sitting in the sauna, can help us to get some adaptation to humidity and heat. Even if you're not necessarily running in it, it still helps with that adaptation, because really what we're trying to do is to get our body better at all the things that help to cool us. And it takes a period of like 7 to 14 days for us to fully adapt. And the adaptations that we need to take place are all the things that help our bodies to cool ourselves. And so it takes time for your body to relearn those processes. So that's why we talk about, when it's the first warm day, if that's what your race day is and you haven't done any training or any acclimation to that, your body's not going to be as optimal at, uh, you're going to be slower to start sweating, which means that you're going to be slower to start cooling your internal temperature, which means that you're also at increased risk for heat illness. And so there's a lot of things that we want to make sure that we start to chip away at in small ways. I don't want you to do crazy things in the 2 weeks leading up to race day. You shouldn't be completely crushing yourself. Um, just doing, some starting with some easy runs, taking them really easy if you're in the taper. And then, doing a couple days in the sauna, nothing crazy. We don't want these to be things that end up exhausting you. Doing your workouts maybe in a little bit warmer conditions and backing off your paces just to kind of get yourself ready. Keeping the effort steady and not overdoing it. It can just help us to be better prepared for warm conditions. So.
Yeah, and I think for runners who are deciding between like running outside versus the treadmill, my view has always been that the treadmill will get you fit. Like it is a running motion, but I find that one of the biggest drawbacks is that weather adaptation piece. You don't get used to the wind or the rain or the hills. I mean,
Yeah.
granted, you can do a little incline on the treadmill, but it's still not quite the same thing as the real deal.
Yeah, that's going to be the biggest challenge. But, the way that I see it is, especially with the training adaptation piece, like if you're using the treadmill to help us acclimate to the heat within 2 weeks of the race, you've probably done all the adaptations that we really need and your body is prepared in a lot of ways. And you're probably going to do your pre race and your last couple of runs outdoors in the conditions and the elements before race day. So that part will be taken care of a little bit. And so, yeah, I think it's important that you don't overdo that. It's good to still get outside and expose yourself to elements. But, and I think that's also where, doing some of your runs that pop up on your schedule, they don't have to be just in the taper that you take advantage of these opportunities. Like if it's raining and your race is still like 2 months away, like, maybe I'll do this run in the rain just to have the experience in it. And I did that with a run. It was a few months ago. It was like a cold rain. I had 11 miles and I was like, well, let's just do it. I did my 11 miles and then I had a double and I did my second run on the treadmill. Like that was how I sort of balanced that. And by the end of it, I was like, that was not fun. That 11-mile run was not fun, but I also was kind of like, cool. I just did that. That wasn't fun, but it was
It's a
now
type 2 fun.
yeah, I felt more accomplished at the end of it. So there's that.
Yeah, I want to get your thoughts on one training paradox because, in terms of adaptation and even mental training, we've talked all about specificity and prepare yourself for the heat or the cold. One thing that boggles my mind, even though scientifically there is a lot of backing for it, is the idea that a lot of elite athletes will go and train at altitude for races at sea level. That's like the one example I can think of where high level runners will specifically seek out a climate very different from where they'll be racing. So, what do you think are the benefits of that, and why do athletes do it that way?
Yeah, it's mostly just I think from the like blood plasma perspective of like how your body changes in relation to being, it's harder to train to altitude, your recovery is slower. And so when you come down from altitude, I think it's something to do with like you have this increase in blood plasma. So you are in a better position to be able to perform faster at sea level. And then you don't have the negative side effects of being at altitude, which is a little bit slower pace. Slower recovery. So when you come down, then you're just in a more prime and optimal space to race fast. The thing that I find is that a lot of times training at altitude also comes with less humidity. There's definitely places you can go train where it's high altitude and high humidity, but I think a lot of the prime sort of areas in the US that people go tend to also not carry as much humidity. And so
Mhm.
from that perspective, I find especially if you're going to be in a race that's warm, the altitude training has a similar effect that heat training has on you, but the altitude training is not going to be quite as uncomfortable as training in humidity. So I think that's something because they've said that heat training is the poor man's altitude. So training in a hot, humid climate can have similar effects. And actually, from what the research has shown, it can have actually like a longer term effect. It's a slightly different mechanism that gets you there, but it's very similar in the effects that you get from it. And so the I think though the benefit of training in a hot, humid climate and getting similar benefits is that you're training through more uncomfortability more often, and so that also helps us from it helps us if it's humid on race day, and it also helps us if it's cool on race day. We're gonna be more optimally prepared for running fast in cooler weather if it ends up being cooler, even if we've been training in the heat. So I think that that's something to consider. And that's, I know a lot of people will race Grandma's Marathon here, and that race isn't till what, like mid-June in the US. So it's one of the
Yeah.
faster marathons. And you can end up with a warm day for sure. I've been there when it's been warm. But if it's remotely cooler that time of the year, if you're from a lot of other areas of the country, you're probably training your last few big weeks in a much more harsh conditions. It's probably a lot more humid, a lot hotter. So you're probably getting, but then when you go down to that race and it's cooler, it's beneficial to us. So I think very similarly to how training at altitude can help us at sea level, so can training in the heat and humidity, and then getting a cooler weather race day can help us be able to run faster. And so I think it's a similar mechanism there that we see. And so, um, yeah, I think that there's still like some amount of adaptation they say that you need to sort of be prepared for if you're coming down from altitude, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
So if you live in the Northeast and you're near sea level and you don't have warm weather during the winter time, you're just out of luck.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's got a little bit more of a challenge. You don't have quite as much stimulus for adversity, but hey, you get you do have to train through some pretty brutal winters, I imagine. So,
Yeah, there's a lot of adversity. You just
yeah.
might not get extra blood plasma from it. The winters are no joke.
Yeah, for sure. There's just you little bit of that loss. Just do a training camp down in Florida. You'll be fine.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's get into how you actually dress for different race conditions. I think to me, perfect race day conditions, those are straightforward. I think everyone has the routine. It's usually either like splits or tights and a singlet for men, and then maybe you have your sports bra and similar bottoms for women. But then let's say we'll start on the cold end. If it dips below 30, what are you putting on for race day?
Me personally, I'm probably gonna wear maybe like a little ear warmer. Um, I probably will wear gloves if it's 30. Probably wear gloves. Um, I don't know though. I've liked arm sleeves in the past just because I can pull them down if I feel like I'm getting warm. So that's always something I'll bring with me, and I'll kind of decide that on race day. Um, that's still 30. I'd still probably wear a crop or a tank top, and then shorts, uh, and then otherwise just socks, my shoes. So nothing too crazy on for me. I think that might vary by person. Some people may feel more comfortable wearing something like a half tight. The other important thing that I think is good to consider here, and I don't know about you, but I tend to feel like if my upper body is warm, I'm good. If my
Yeah,
but I know that there are people who are the opposite, where if their legs are warm, they're good. They don't need to have as much layers up top, and so that's something to know about yourself. Is where do you need to cover to make sure your body stays warm? So um, some people may prefer wearing a hat. The problem I have with hats, like a winter hat, is that they tend to slide up, and then my ears aren't covered. So I don't that just gets annoying. So I want something that's gonna stay over my ears because that's really what I'm trying to keep warm. So that's something to consider. I know some people like to wear like calf sleeves or something like that, just
yeah,
to keep their lower legs warm. So that's an option. And and yeah, I mean you can always again wear that extra layer to start and then peel it off and toss it if you're feeling like you're getting a little bit warm. But don't avoid overdressing because or like be prepared from a layering perspective when you intend to take things off if you're not going to wear them anymore. Because if you start sweating underneath those layers, then when you take them off, you might get cold from overheating a little bit, so then the sweat sort of starting to dry in your skin. So just sort of have a plan for this, and this is actually something you can test in training, with prepare in different temperatures. Like if it's gonna be 30, what do you feel best doing workouts in, because that's going to help you to decide how you'll feel on race day in different outfits and stuff. So yeah.
yeah. I think throwaways are good. Test them for sure. The other thing I was gonna add, you talked about like sleeves or tights to partially cover up your body. I think similarly with the hat, like if it's kind of that in between where it's a little cold to not wear anything, but you don't want a full winter hat. I see a lot of runners who either do like a headband, or I've also seen I think it's really popular with like collegiate cross country runners when they have like they're kind of like earmuffs. Do you know what they're called?
I don't. I've always used the one that's like essentially like a headband that goes like here and around my ears and
Okay, yeah.
behind. But I haven't ever used like earmuffs particularly. But yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah, no, I definitely see runners. I don't know if they're like sport specific or just regular earmuffs, but yeah, just to like cover up your ears without having something over your head that's gonna make you sweat.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay. All right, so let's go on the other end. So let's say it gets warm. You're probably not gonna change your race outfit at like 50, 60 degrees. If it gets up to like 80, 90, are you doing anything different or do you stick to your normal race outfit?
So one thing that I had a coach tell me to do when I was first racing in the Olympic trials in 2016 when it was supposed to be pretty hot in LA. He said to get like a white hat specifically. You don't want a dark hat because that's going to attract the sun more. It's going to cause a little bit more heating. So a light colored hat can be beneficial from a like kind of helping you to not sweat so much, get so much sweat in your eyes because a lot of times it's going to have a little bit of help from the band of the hat where if especially if it's a sports one, it's going to sort of absorb a little bit of that sweat, so you're getting less of it in the eyes. But it also helps keep your head a little cooler. And the other thing that I find is because it's like a material and it's like a fabric, pouring water over your head, which is a really really good thing to do when it's hot because that's going to really help us to keep our body temperature down. Um, the hat will absorb some of that. So it'll actually stay a little bit wetter for longer than your hair might, especially if you have dark colored
Mm.
hair like me. Like this is just going to attract the sun more. So the hat actually helps to kind of counteract some of that and can help you just stay a little bit cooler in warmer weather, and it's especially helpful if it's sunny. So we didn't really talk too much about sunny weather, but that was something that last year's Boston was warm and it was also sunny. And when you think about when you're seeing the temperature, if it says 60, 70 out, just temperature wise outside, when you're out there on that blacktop and it's sunny out, the temperature is going to feel warmer than that down on the street. So that's going to add an extra layer of heat. And then also you think about all the people around you. So it's going to feel a lot warmer than what the temperature might be showing if it's a sunny day. And so that's where that hat can be a valuable add. Um, I don't know. Some people might like sweatbands just to kind of help prevent some of the sweat from going down to their eyes, which is definitely a factor because it can be blinding a little bit when you get that little bit of sweat in your eyes and it stings. So that's not super fun. Um, but other things to consider are I know that I've seen people wear buffs because those can also be good ways to you can pour water on them and then pull them up over your face. So that can be helpful just for keeping you cool a little bit. And you can always keep those wet, which will help to keep the back of your neck cool. So there's options on things like that. Um, but for the most part, right, you're probably going to be you want to be wearing shorts, want to be wearing a tank top, not wanting to be overdressed, and wearing one. You're probably going to be wanting to wear lighter colors, especially with the jersey. So yeah.
Yeah, where do you stand on assuming it's a light color, something like arm sleeves or longer socks that are going to cover part of your body?
Oh, like arm sleeves when it's warmer.
Yeah,
I wouldn't do it.
would or wouldn't?
I would not. That
Would
would
not.
crush me. I think I no. I've always when it's been warm, I've always been crop top, shorts, or tank top. Nothing. I don't want to overdress that. Um, yeah, but I normally do hat, my whatever shirt I'm wearing, and shorts, and then not trying to add too many layers if I can possibly.
Yeah, I'm mostly the same. I do know a lot of runners, especially trail runners, I think really like their longer socks.
Hmm.
Um, the other thing I do even without though is I'm not a big fan of racing in sunglasses. I know a lot of people have a hard time running, when it's sunny out without them.
Yeah, I like sunglasses. I've come to appreciate them a little bit more. I don't like it though wearing sunglasses when the sun is in and out because that annoys me so
Yeah.
much. Like going from like it being too dark to being light to do, so if it's going to be like back and forth, that's where I think the hat can also be beneficial because it actually does give you a little bit of coverage over your eyes so you don't feel like you're squinting.
Yeah.
And so I think that can kind of, if you're not a big sunglasses person, a hat can help sort of counteract some of the reasons that you might want to wear sunglasses. But if they annoy you while racing, then a hat could help.
Yeah, and the other thing with sunglasses is there's not really throwaway sunglasses the way you
Yeah.
can with, like you can get gloves that from the dollar store for $1. If you get like a $5 pair of glasses, like they're gonna be miserable to race in. They're just not good
Yeah.
quality.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean the sunglasses I've enjoyed racing in are the Gooders because they don't bounce and they're pretty lightweight, and they're also not too expensive, so they don't feel quite as bad if something were to happen to them while running in them. But for sure, you don't want to just like get a cheap pair and then find out that they're the worst thing to run in and they're uncomfortable on race day.
Yeah, I think the Gooders are affordable. They're probably not like quite cheap enough that I would intentionally throw them away in
Oh
the
yeah,
middle of a race.
I did get a free pair of sunglasses from they're just like the ones they gave us at races, and I've been wearing them, and they're actually not bad. They're like similar fit and style to Gooder. They're probably a little bit lighter weight and cheaper materials, but they stay put pretty well. And I'm like, so I've been using them for workouts because I'm like, I don't care that much if anything happens to these as much. So they came free in my as my part of my swag for my race. So take advantage of those. If you see like some free sunglasses at race expos, grab them, test them out in training, see if you like them, and save them if you're like not sure if you're gonna want sunglasses and then you end up tossing them because those can be good throwaways if you're not super invested in them.
Definitely. I think I haven't bought a pair of sunglasses in like 3 or 4 years because I've won three different pairs
Oh,
at races, which it's a nice little thing, you know. I have a million pairs of shirts and shorts, but you really appreciate the sunglasses in the summertime.
oh yeah, yeah. I had a pair of Gooders that I didn't treat super well. I don't know how they ended up so scratched, but I put them on and I like could not see. They were so they were so scratched that it looked like they were smudged and I was like, I just need to throw these away. These are old.
Yeah.
um but I have so many other pairs because they're great for wearing, you know, when you need them for races or just out doing stuff. So
Yeah, nice. Okay, so think we've pretty much touched on just about every type of weather at this point, but we're kind of getting into the point now as this comes out, it's mid-April, just sneaking up on marathon season for most people. For anyone out there who's kind of checking the weather forecast or maybe will be in the coming weeks as they get close to race day, if it's looking like it's not going to be ideal, what advice would you have for them?
I think the most important thing is to figure out what your plan will be adjustment wise. Have a plan in place. I think the number one mistake that most runners make is not adjusting to the weather conditions. They know what they trained for. They know what they want to run, and they don't adjust for weather. And then they go out there at the pace they trained for, and then at some point things start to go south, and then it just makes the day much more difficult than it needed to be. I think we've talked about this in previous podcasts before, but oftentimes when we go out too fast in races, we blow up and run slower than we were physically capable of. Like we are trained to be able to run faster. We don't reach our potential on that race day. And so same thing goes with like if it's too warm and we go out too fast, we probably could have run faster by starting slower and running slower overall, but we would have run a faster time probably. We probably would have put more in been able to then see ourselves negative split more realistically for the conditions. And so that's the number one thing is that let's just go ahead and adjust. Try not to be stubborn and think about like this is the goal that I set for myself and I'm going to do it. You can still reach those goals, like we said, with the using that calculator to your advantage, uh, to kind of give yourself an equated if I can run about this pace, then I kind of accomplished what my goal was. Cool. Like that's a good way for us to just recognize that we made the best effort for this day. And so that's my number one piece of advice is run for the day that you're given, not for the day that you're hoping for. So that way, whatever happens, you can walk away from that experience knowing that you put forth the best effort you had on that specific day, because that's all you can do. You can't change the weather. You can't change things out of your control. Same thing goes with, there's days that our bodies just don't show up to race day as well as we would have liked. And how do we approach those days? How do we make the most of them, so we can keep using these experiences for positive growth? And so that's what we kind of have to do in these experiences, when it's also different conditions that we wouldn't have chosen for ourselves, is to just be able to recognize that we're taking this opportunity to see what our body can do in these conditions, and just excited about, being able to challenge ourselves in that way. It's a different challenge than running a PR, but it's still a worthy, challenge to put yourself up to.
Yeah, and I think we as runners, we like a challenge. We like working hard, but we like choosing that challenge and the weather not being one of it. So I think it's good if you can see it as an opportunity and just another challenge to go after.
Yeah, don't be stubborn. Don't That's also the way of the runner. I feel like we're all super stubborn. We want what we want, and we don't like it when we can't go after what we want. So don't be stubborn.
Yeah, there's your takeaway. Don't be stubborn. All
Yes.
right, this was awesome, Andy. I'm wishing you excellent weather for all of your races, and I'm sure you'll do great, even if it's complete crap weather, because we've gone over everything, all the right things to do.
Yeah, we're ready. I feel more ready for my race this weekend, just having had this conversation. And yeah, it'll be fun, and good luck to everyone with races coming up. I hope the weather is in your favor, but if not, I hope this podcast is able to help you adapt and enjoy the day.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Andy.